Hello and welcome guys to this new series. It's International Master Alex Astaneh here with Chessfactor, and the intention with this series is to cover, well, perhaps arguably the most important topic in chess, which is the topic of decision making. The way we're actually doing this is we have a separate video series on calculation, and that's actually going to deal with more of the aspects of, he takes, I take, he takes, I take, this kind of the arithmetic of chess, so to speak. Decision making this particular series is going to involve a little bit more like practical, intuitive points. So, for example, we might talk about at some point time management, the psychology of decision making, but also we're going to dig into, what at first glance might seem to a very experienced player might seem like the right plan. And we're going to try to understand, or the right move even, and we're going to try to understand, break down why very experienced master level players think that this is the way to go. And hopefully that will help us to really take our decision making to the next level. So for this particular first video, what we're going to be talking about is the difference between sensing the moment when we should play actively and when we should play more passively or defensively, right? So sometimes I think we've all been there in chess. We're kind of on the back foot and our opponent is the one calling the shots and we're reacting to them. And other times we're the ones that are pressing our opponent and forcing them to react to our plans and our intentions. So before I dive into that, by the way, if you do like this concept as a series, please subscribe, and that way you'll be notified of future videos in the series. And also, of course, if you like this specific video, give us a like. It always helps to keep us motivated and, of course, to help us to grow the channel. So with that out of the way, what I want to talk about is this first position here on the board. So this is a game between Vasily Smyslov and Mikhail, two former world champions. And Tal had the black pieces, a very aggressive attacking player, but also a very plain strong player, and actually very positionally wise player as well, although not as many people realize this. Okay, in this position, what we're talking about is, as I say, active versus passive play. And so if we group possible moves, what are known as candidate moves, into active or passive, we might have moves such as, let's say, queen to c7 or queen to d7 as a little bit more passive moves in this case. They're not super passive, of course. A move like king g7 might also be useful, but they're not, trying to really strike and undermine the opponent's position. More active moves in this position, feel free to pause the video and try to think of some active moves here available to black. Okay, so the move that I'm going to say is maybe the most active move in this position is the move pawn to f5. Because it makes contact with the enemy's forces here on e4, and it seeks to try and bring the pieces into play, the black pieces into play. Other active moves might be moves such as some knight jump. In this case, there's not too many attractive knight jumps, maybe knight to b5 or knight to b4, but again, these seem to be covered. b5 also, of course, is an active move, striking at this knight, but doesn't seem very attractive in this case because white would capture the pawn on c5. And perhaps also we might have some other pawn advances on the king side to try and make contact with the enemy pawn chain over here. So we've identified a list of possible active moves and a list of possible passive moves. But the question is, which type of move is likely to be best? Which category in this position? And in order to know this, what we need to look at, I think, mainly are two factors. One is the activity of our pieces relative to our opponent's pieces, and the safety of our king relative to our opponent's king. So in this case, we can see that at first glance, both kings seem to be relatively safe. However, when it comes to piece activity, we can see that the black pieces are actually far better coordinated than the white pieces. The reason for this is especially marked in the case of the knights. The bishops are, you could have a bit of a long discussion as to which bishop is better. My opinion, by the way, is that it's the black bishop is slightly better because the white bishop is hemmed in by its own pawns. But the counter argument to that would be that currently black's bishop is also quite passive. But in the case of the knights, it's a very clear situation. These two knights, we can see the knight on a4 is biting on granite, and the knight on c2 is similarly biting on granite. And we know that squares like a4 and c2 are not traditionally good squares for the knights that generally want to be in the center. The black knights are far better centralized, and not only that, but the c6 knight may have a beautiful square in e5, as central as it gets, while the knight on d6 exerts pressure on e4, which might become very relevant if we do choose the move that we've identified as the most active move in this position, which is f5. So overall, our piece activity is much better. And if we look at the king safety once again, we can actually say that there's a lot more potential danger for white than there is for black. And the best way of imagining this is if we imagine that these two bishops were to just come off the board. And if that happens, what we see is that although at first sight this would appear symmetrical, there is a key difference. And the key difference is that white's pawns are all dark squared pawns, while black's are all light squared pawns. That means that structurally, the danger, the squares that are not well protected for black, are the dark squares, while for white, it's the light squares that are being held together just by this bishop. But if we imagine a position where these bishops are out of the way, we can immediately see that there could be a lot of danger with ideas like knight e5 to f3, devastating check here, forking the king and queen. So in fact, that's something worth noting, that king safety for now is actually very good for white, especially since he has this reinforcement of this bishop that black doesn't. But longer term, because black's pieces are so much more active, if white loses this bishop, he's going to be in some serious danger. Therefore, once we determine that our pieces are better placed and our king is likely to be more safe, then active moves are more attractive, because the logic is that if the position opens up and a bunch of lines open up, we're probably going to be in much better shape to actually take advantage of it. So that's how the master level players might think. They might say, well, f5 is very attractive and it should be a good move. Now let's dig deep and work out the specifics, because it might be an exception to the rule and it might be that it's not a good move on this occasion. However, when calculating this, I think most players, and Tal certainly on the day, realized this is the way to go. Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Of course, white has a decision point himself. Does he play the move f3, or does he play the move pawn takes f5? Well, in this case, neither one is very attractive to white. If he captures the pawn, or rather, let's say if he plays f3 to try to support this point on e4, the problem is that after black captures on e4, white is not really in ideal shape whichever way he recaptures. If he takes on e4, the problem is that black now has a protected passed pawn, which is a very strong asset. So the removal, the exchange of these two pawns effectively, is in black's favor. Conversely, if after f takes e4, white takes f takes e4, the f file has opened up, and because black's pieces are in better shape, he is more than likely going to be in the best shape to take over to take over the f-file and to use it to his advantage. But maybe even more important than this is that black can now put his knight on e5, and the importance of the f-pawns having dropped is that white never has the possibility of playing f4 and kicking back this knight. So the knight has gained a beautiful central outpost from where it can press certain points like the d3 point here, and of course constantly threaten ideas like knight f3. So therefore, it's not a very good idea, if we go back to this position, it's not a very good idea for white to try and hold. To recap, once black captures, if white takes with the f-pawn, then you have a beautiful outpost on e5 and the potential of using the f-file to your favor. On the other hand, if you recapture in this way, so this is like this and you recapture this way, then this passed pawn is very strong. Therefore, Vasily Smyslov captured with e takes f5. And now we have our second decision point as black. So, of course, here we could play, let's say, the most typical move in this position, or the most normal looking move, is to capture this pawn on f5. But instead, Tal finds a better continuation. Maybe if you wish, you can pause the video and try and see, do you see what the idea might be here? So, I'll show the move. Tal chose the move knight to e5 instead, giving up the pawn. Now that's a very active move, right? He tries to get the knight, improve his knight, and he ignores material considerations. He offers white the possibility of winning another pawn. Why is he able to get away with this kind of active play? The answer is because when you capture here on g6, after the bishops come off the board, that early point that we made about the king's safety being a big issue suddenly comes into play. Once that light square bishop is gone, the king is very, very weak along the light squares. And notice, when knights are on dark squares, they actually play on light squares. So the knight and the queen can combine here. The best move is queen b7 check. And well, no matter what you do, if you're white, you're in serious trouble. If you go back to g1, there's going to be knight f3. If you go to f1, there's going to be queen h1 check. And if you go to h3, then how are you getting back to safety anytime soon, right? Black can probably even take here and prepare a rook to come to h8. It's a lot of arrows, I realize, but hopefully, hopefully that's more or less clear that white cannot afford to go down such a line. And so white, instead of that, he said he couldn't afford to play something greedy like capture this pawn, and instead he chose to move pawn to f4. But after knight f3 check, black had gotten what he wanted. Bishop was forced to capture, and after bishop takes f3, those light squares are going to be a problem. Those light squares around the king are going to be a serious problem for the rest of the game. And again, black is not concerned about potentially losing a pawn, because after just a simple retreat of the bishop, you want to take it to a8 so that you can set up this battery. After that happens, yes, white can grab a couple of pawns and be very, very happy, materially speaking, but he's not going to survive the attack. And you notice these pieces are absolutely monstrous for black, and the knights on c2 and a4 remain in their starting squares. So we can see why black was able to, successfully play in the most active way possible, because he started with two key advantages in his favor. The main advantage, I would say, is his pieces were simply much, much better placed than the white counterparts. And we only talked about the minor pieces. We should also maybe quickly comment on the fact that the rooks are also a little bit better for black than for white. But in my view, the critical difference is these knights. But we also were able to make the decision to strike with the most active move, cracking open the position, because of the fact that we recognized that the white king is going to be very weak on the light squares if we can just get rid of this key defender on g2. So Tal did play f5 and Smyslov put up a good fight, but eventually Mikhail Tal won a very, very nice game in the end game. So we won't look at the rest of the game as it's not relevant. But this concludes our first video on our introduction to this new series on decision making. I'm going to actually give you a couple of positions where you may wish to suggest whether you feel that an active move is best or a passive move is best. So let's throw that up there now. Okay, so in this first example, what I would like you to do is think about the black position here. Think about the two factors that I mentioned, which is king safety and the piece placement. How good are your pieces compared to your opponents? And think about whether those two factors indicate to you if you should probably play actively, or you should play more conservatively, a little bit more reactionary to your opponent's threats, trying to diffuse the possibilities in your opponent's position. So to be a little bit more concrete, some active moves in this position that might come to mind are moves like queen to g5, trying to generate an attack, or perhaps you could argue some type of move like rook d7 in order to try to prepare a double up and contest the d-file, although this is a multi-purpose move. But I really think queen g5 or g6, moves like those trying to generate an attack, are maybe some of the more active continuations. A little bit more passive, a little bit more conservative would be moves like, for example, queen to b7 here, or rook to c8, just kicking the queen away, or knight to b7. So what I'd like you to think about is not just a specific move that you would play in this position. You can write it down in the comments of this YouTube video if you'd like. Write down your choice of move. And on top of that, even more important than this is say, do you think that this position requires you to play actively or passively? So you can write actively and your move, or passively and your move. And again, passive is a little bit of a subject to interpretation kind of word in this context. It might be more reactionary or more conservative. Take your pick. But hopefully the message is clear. So here is the second and final example. This one is taken from one of my own games. And here I had the white pieces. And black, my opponent had just played the move king to g7. So in this position, black has a little bit of pressure against this knight, attacking it once, only defending once, and also has some pressure here against b2. It's a little bit difficult to develop this bishop. Now, active moves to consider in this position are to grab this pawn on e7, and the other active move that I thought about was the move bishop to e3, just offering this pawn on b2 in order to continue our development. That's an active, energetic move. Those are the active moves. The more passive or conservative options would be to consolidate here on b2 and on d5 by bringing this knight back to c3, or to try to just reduce the pressure of this bishop on d4 by simply playing a move like rook to d1 and just sort of hoping the bishop itself will become a little bit more passive on a different square. So that's your choice between the active and the passive moves. I'd like you to do the same again. Write down which type of move you think this position calls for, and then write down which particular move you think would be strongest. And in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and quickly run through the two options and explain the two examples and explain to you guys what the rationale of both positions are, and you guys can compare notes. So this has been the first video. In the second video, I'm going to show examples. An example of where passive play was a little bit more appropriate than active play, and I'll run you down the logic there. So of course it's connected to the first video, same concepts but in reverse. Hope that this has made sense. If you've enjoyed this video, as always, give it a like, subscribe, comment, all of the usual. I hope that you stick around with us for this series, and I'll see you in the next video.